All right, thank you. I'm Emiliana Vegas. I'll start the presentation and we're going to be tag team today. Let me see. So I'm a professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And prior to that, I did a lot of work in the development banks in Washington, D.C. and many developing countries. So to motivate our talk, we wanted to start by giving just some numbers on the global education context. We are in a situation where enrollment is rising all over the world. At the same time, 28%, about a third of students in low and middle income countries are enrolled in low cost private schools. So there's clearly a government sort of challenge to expand education. And more importantly, learning levels are stagnant worldwide, and we'll show you some data. So we're very far from meeting the SDG 4 of ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education for all. And COVID just set us back even more. This is a figure just from the US National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP. It's the reading scores over the last 50 years. And as you can see, very little progress, both in age 9 and 13, just stagnant learning, even in advanced countries like the US. And when we look at what happened between 2019 and 2022, sort of the impact of the pandemic, let's say, in learning poverty, a term that the World Bank uses to refer to children 10 years old who cannot read. And what you can see is an increase in all regions of the world. The average is in the red, I believe. But then South Asia going from 60 to 78, Latin America striking from 52% of children 10 years old who could not read to 79%. So really striking levels of low learning across the developing world, and exacerbated by the pandemic. But this is despite lots of spending. Gates Foundation invested around $70 million in the global education program. DFID, or FCDO, the UK development arm, has invested $1.5 billion, and the World Bank Group $45 billion in education worldwide. And this is without including regional development banks and other multilateral organizations that also contribute to this pocket of money. And this really implies a declining productivity. So this is a paper where they document the productivity of American public schools between 1970 and 2000, measured by the points in the NAEP, that same exam per $1,000 of real per pupil spending, and we can see a sharp decline over time. And the central question is, how can we improve value for money in education? And this is, I think, when I hand it over to you to start the
conversation. So we're tag teaming a bit just to kind of keep the post-lunch sleepiness away. And so, you know, what Emiliana sort of has set us up is really, in some sense, a fundamental question we think in education research is really about learning, right? I mean, obviously, there's been a tremendous amount of work on enrollment and a whole bunch of out-of-school children, that sort of stuff as well. But really, if you look at the kind of stark question that both developed and developing countries are facing, it's essentially, how do we improve kind of value for money? And value for money in this case is, how do we get more learning outcomes for less resources, especially given the kind of declining productivity results you've seen. And some of the stuff we share, in fact, we've now set up an initiative at CID called Gear Up, which is really trying to sort of focus on this question. And what we're doing in focusing on this question is we want to take sort of a more systems kind of view of things. And one way to think about this is, there is a, you know, if we think kind of what is exciting research in education, there's been tremendous, I mean, yesterday, you know, celebrating JPAL 20, there's been a tremendous amount of really great research in RCTs and causal inference in education. And in some ways, one way to think about that world has been, it's been very much a sort of input augmentation approach, which is you sort of think about the educational production function and quality or something, and you say, look, what are the inputs that could be really helpful in this educational production function? and whether it be sort of textbooks or teachers or some technology you're using. And then we try and get a very precise partial elasticity on that input, right? You try and, precise being you kind of do some sort of experimental variation, you change the input, you see what the return to that input is. And that's been a really powerful approach. We would argue that the approach that kind of we have been pushing, and both kind of Emiliana and my work and others, in fact, concurrently to us, which was unfortunate timing, but Chris Nielsen is running a session in education, and Chris's work is very similar, which is much more a systems and markets-based approach. And we want to present that as an exciting approach that other researchers and younger researchers can follow. That approach has some challenges to it, and I'll share with you, but I think it's going to be, it has some positive and exciting things happening as well. But in this kind of input augmentation approach, one of the challenges that we don't talk about as much is when you ran that experiment or we did that partial elasticity, how did you pick what you wanted to work on? What was that input you ended up picking? And secondly, there's a whole bunch of discussion around, is this generalizable? Just because, you know, textbooks worked well or remedial teaching worked well in one context, does that extend to another context? And so we talk about replication studies in that area. For us, sort of the approach that we've been thinking about, and you can call it systems or markets, depending on how econ-y you want to be, but the essential idea is much more thinking in general equilibrium terms in what you're doing, system and thinking in system level terms. And this approach has these features, and we're sort of advocating for what we would call thick description or rich description in these fields as well, which is before you decide to intervene in an educational ecosystem, whatever your context is, it's really valuable to map all the relevant actors, even if you're thinking of a very specific thing. Let's say you're thinking about secondary school education or primary education or early childhood education, whatever that starting node of interest of yours is, that node shouldn't be viewed in isolation. So you could, an example of viewing the node in isolation is you might say, well, I'm interested in ECD, early childhood development, or early childhood ECE, or early childhood education. And what I'm going to look at is I'm going to look at the key, a pre-kindergarten program that, my state or the context I'm in is working on. I think it would be a mistake if you only focused on that. The approach we're advocating is you say, when you look at that child's early learning, think about all the elements, all the actors which are interfacing with that child. It could be the home environment, it could be the sibling environment, it could be a formal educational environment. Now, you can imagine doing that at different levels as well. You can imagine doing the same kind of approach for a middle school or elementary school. And when you do this exercise, what you find is you find both direct linkages. Imagine a middle schooler. You find that middle schooler might be traditionally in a schooling system, but there may be huge sibling effects for that middle schooler happening. Elder siblings may be actually effective teachers as well. You may also be affected just by the environment. There's some really nice papers that say what happens about the neighborhood you're in and how does that affect your schooling. And so suddenly going from like that formal interaction, you recognize that there's siblings, there's friends, there's the neighborhood you're living in. There's actually increasingly just the sheer environment, like climate change and education, we think is a very interesting area to work on as well. But literally climatic conditions may be affecting your learning. So this kind of, so our first approach is to say, take that actor and see all of the actors which directly affect that actor, and then they're indirect actors as well. So again, even if you're looking at schooling, you might say, well, the quality of my schooling is a function of textbooks, and textbooks are a function of curriculum design, and that's a function of the supply of alternative curricula or alternative textbook, like even something as dry, apologies if you are excited about that, but like textbook publishing. Which seems to be like, well, I'm interested in middle school education. Why should I care about textbook publishing? But it could be very much the quality of the kind of variety of pedagogical material you get is a function in your ecosystem of how robust the supply of textbooks market is. And by the way, if you want to look at dirty politics, that's a fun market to look into because it gets really high stakes very quickly. And so that's kind of the mapping the ecosystem. And then in this approach, we very much borrow from kind of markets or systems friction approach or system dynamics, which is say, when you think of this actor and all the exchanges or all the other actors who are interacting with this actor, you start asking, what are the frictions in that interface? So instead of picking an input, you identify a systemic level friction. And so imagine if you thought, well, I think textbooks would be helpful. Textbooks is not a friction, right? But being able to access pedagogical material is a friction. And you might say, well, the reason you don't have good pedagogical material may not be because you didn't have a pretty textbook that I could give you. It's that I didn't have a healthy publishing or competitive publishing environment. Or it couldn't be that there wasn't a realization of the value of pedagogical inputs with a variety of inputs. So the friction the experiment you end up running, and very much we do run experiments, is very different from the experiment you might have thought. Like even if you identify textbooks, you're not going to provide textbooks and randomize that. You might actually do something literally with the textbook hiring committee or the publishing group and do something there and see through the implications of that. And then this is how we test solutions. So once we have the frictions identified, then you can go to very much modern tools of randomized controlled trials or other causal inference methods. But the initial approach looks fairly different. And we're actually advocating, and often, it feels like Emiliana and I both have done this, where in our research, when we would go in environments, often we might have had priors when we went in, but I don't think we went in committed to run an experiment or a particular input. And often, when you've read some literature, you're like, well, I'm really about peer learning. So I'm going to go in there and my attempt is going to find out what is a modern way to do peer interactions. And I mean, Emily was just giving a great talk on social networks. I'm committed to social networks. I'm just going to manipulate them. And I think there's a danger in that approach, which is you close yourself out to something which would be far more salient in the environment just because you're so enamored by some theory or some paper you've read. Those are great priors, but you should all be Bayesians. You should be updating your priors based on what the world is telling you. And for that, I'm a huge proponent of much more, what an anthropologist would have called thick description, what a sociologist may call sort of initial exploratory kind of work, what we in development or education might just call preparatory analysis. But I want to give it some more serious recognition. I mean, again, it's hard to publish that kind of work. I get it. But I actually think it makes your work, your research much more original and frankly, much likely to have a significant effect if you're worried about that. We had a whole publishing session about publishing positive and non-positive results. So this is in many ways a plea. If you're feeling insecure and you're in that early research career and your advisor might be, or your colleagues might be saying, well, where's that paper? Take your time in doing this kind of descriptive stuff. It'll have payoffs. And look, you shouldn't trust what we're saying. We should kind of show you whether this works. We've been doing this work let's not age ourselves, for several years. We've been doing this kind of work. I'm going to talk about some examples from Pakistan. Emiliana is I'm going to hand over to her. She's going to talk about some examples from Chile. And then we're going to go back and say, why do we think fundamentally? You can get the details of what we are doing, but that's available on the websites and stuff as well. We want to really fundamentally at the end with why do we think conceptually this is a somewhat different way about looking at the world, and we think this is an important thing to do in education as well. And also in some ways, when I first started attending NEUDCs, a large fraction of our sessions were actually on education. Now that's less the case. And I think there is a need in our field to start kind of injecting some new energy, some new ideas in the field, especially since we haven't achieved, it's not that we can go home and say, declare success, we're done with learning outcomes, right? We're not. Actually, we're still struggling. So it's not that we've moved on from this field because we've achieved great success in the field. It's the opposite. We have struggled in getting some of the things at least implemented at scale. And so in Pakistan, the first example I'm going to give, and you guys are welcome to kind of look at the website, which has more detail on it as well. We think this way of thinking can be pretty powerful. And I'm just going to give you, I'm not going to show you papers. I'm just going to give you ideas that are actually papers and kind of what happened with this sort of approach. And so the first one was the classic market failure, if you will, in any market is information. So we have this study, we being myself, a guy called Jishnu Das, who's at the Georgetown now, and a person called Tahir Andrabi, who's at Pomona. And so we had this kind of work where we essentially shocked markets with information. And we wanted to see what would happen if we allowed parents to better be able to discern between good and not so good schools. And the answer is you see exactly what Econ 101 would suggest you see. In fact, in many ways, our work has been very much, markets actually, sure, they're imperfections, but when you try and address those imperfections, things work shockingly in education as they would in IO. There's a whole kind of IO and education kind of area now as well. And in this thing, you see exactly what a competitive market would be. Learning outcomes improve, bad schools shut down, enrollment goes up, and actually schools become more affordable. And so what's happening is, if you believe these results, then it suggested that there was rents that these schools were earning. These are both private and public schools in these markets. And by giving information, you're moving some of the rents that school owners were earning and moving them to households, right? Which is exactly what you'd expect in a more empowered household. So that's one example where you alleviate an information friction and things help. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
How, like, you advocated for thick description.
Yes.
At the beginning, be an anthropologist.
Yes.
How did you get to this?
That's a great, thank you, Rem. So that's 30 slides, which I didn't put in. So a lot of, in fact, I teach a class where I talk about how this work came about. And this wasn't the thing we wanted to start. Our prior was not this. Our prior was we wanted to do performance pay in education. So we walked into this environment, which is still a big problem, but we couldn't just do it. And so we started with, like, what is a big problem we should work on in this context? A lot of thick description. We were thinking about enrollment, equity, and learning. And it turned out enrollment was actually looking quite decent, despite what people were saying. When you look at the numbers, actually enrollment was rising. And this is the time when the UN was obsessing with enrollment as a goal. It was universally primary enrollment. We were saying that's just going to happen, right? Because it's already been growing. That's not where the SDGs hadn't quite come up. Learning hadn't quite gotten a lot of focus. It became very obvious in this environment that learning was what the main issue was. When we talked to parents and children, one very big demand came in. I mean, I don't know if you guys in the field have experienced this, but often when I go into a household and talk to them, I become like an impromptu tester, which is the most awkward situation to be in. Like, a 10-year-old is brought in to you, and the parent says, test him. And suddenly you have to decide whether you're going to be like an accurate tester, or, which is really scary, because whatever you say is going to have high stakes with this child, especially if the child doesn't do well, which is kind of true in a lot of these environments. That learning wasn't that great. But it suggested to us that there was a huge demand for parents to learn whether the school they were choosing to send their child to was worth the investment they were making, which is very much what I, as a parent, do when I choose where to live in the US, right? And so for us, I'd admit, I'll be the first one to admit this, I went in as a graduate student having a very particular view of development. And this is the time when Progreso Oportunidades had kind of been really popular. And my view was parents need to be coaxed and cajoled to care about education. And I honestly have spent 20 years, no negative on Progreso. I've spent 20 years and I've rarely found a parent who needs to be cajoled and coaxed to care about their child's education. So that view didn't resonate with us, even though I went in with that prior. And so that's a great, thanks for that kind of nudge. That's a great example where what we ended up thinking we were working on was very different from this. And even, by the way, this kind of stuff, even the details of what you do changes. So when we gave report cards, because that's what the demand was. And we first gave report cards, we again assumed, and I was embarrassed, exposed after this, we assumed that people would be illiterate. And so the report cards should be like these cute, friendly, smiley face type report cards. Have you seen those? Like, how do you feel about your kids learning? And there's like a sad face and a gradually happier face. And the happiest face means child learning is great. When we piloted this kind of stuff, which is critical to do again in these contexts, one of these ladies who I was talking to, a mother who's totally illiterate, smiled at me and said, "This is very sweet and nice, but can you give us a number from 0 to 100? And I was like, "But I thought you're illiterate." They're like, "Yeah, I can't, but I can kind of read numbers and I understand what 0 to 100 means. And even if I can't, I have some friend in the village who can tell me." And that's a more meaningful statistic, because basically you're saying, I don't know what the cardinality of this happy face is. And so, so you'd be surprised when you do these things, how sophisticated. And that's been a consistent lesson in the systems view, that in many ways, my approach, and I think Emiliana would give her version of this, is we're not here to tell people what to do, but people kind of already doing pretty sophisticated decision making. We're just trying to make that job easier, in the same way that a consumer's report in the US would tell me which brand of, like, I don't know, electric sanders I should be buying. Right? So it's very similar to electric sanders. Sorry. I don't know why I came up with that example. But, we have a similar approach we did. So this was on information. We have a similar paper where, again, we did these interviews with schools, and it turned out it was very obvious they were financially constrained, these private schools. Just classic SME kind of, what's your barrier to growth? And it's pretty obvious when you do this, because when you look at their funding sources, Harvard couldn't survive that way, right? Like, most of their sources were either tuition or their own pocket. That's a majority of how these schools are investing. So if your revenue source is only tuition or your own equity, you're going to have scale constraints. And when we asked them what the biggest obstacle was, again, sometimes it's just simple. There's this older literature where we'd ask firms what the constraint to growth is. We'd actually believe it. And then we got really cynical about it and said, no, people don't understand what they're talking about. They pretty much understand what they're talking about. And this led to an experiment where we just gave cash grants, just simply cash grants to a marketplace. And in some places, we only gave cash grants to one school. In other places, we gave cash grants to all schools. And again, we had underlying theory behind why we did that. A lot of people do priority sector lending, but priority sector lending is often based on like, we want to work in agriculture or education or SME type A. This paper made us realize, and it's ex post pretty obvious, that you should also be thinking of the density of lending that you do. So often when we lend, and by the way, education suffers from this, we lend in a way that we create monopolies. So when IFC picks, and I won't mention which school chain they pick, but when they pick a particular school chain in Africa, even more, you effectively make that school chain become a monopolist, and that kills local competition. And so we mimic that by only picking one school at random and giving it money. When we give money to everyone, you actually increase competition because now everyone has money. You're not creating a local monopolist, and we get very different results. This was an RCT. When we give money to one school, it essentially adopts what I would call a market stealing strategy. It's the only game in town. It expands capacity and steals kids from the other schools. No quality improvement. When we give money to every school, actually, everyone in game theoretic sense understands that game is stupid. Like if you all build an extra room, no one's going to show up because everyone's built an extra room. It's going to be empty. So instead, what you do is you invest in teachers. And so you see exactly this. So this is called a crowding in competition or quality. So again, these are very standard. That's what I'm trying to say. These are very standard Econ 101 thinking that somehow as educationists, we forgot. Like you took that first micro course, and you're like, but I'm in education. I don't need to think about these things. But actually, these things work. Competition really works, and leveraging competition really works. And I'll give one example, and then I'm going to turn over to Emiliana. This is one where we looked at labor market failures, where a lot of these schools that we were seeing, especially private schools, were really a function of a local supply of teachers. So we quickly realized that the biggest constraint a lot of these schools face is teaching talent, right? And for those of you who are going to be on the market or about to be in the market, yeah, I mean, for us, mostly in any department, one of the biggest constraints we face is having great colleagues to work with and younger colleagues to work with. And so the equivalent of this version was we worked in areas where we saw a rising presence of schooling, and we realized that was all driven by 20 years ago, the government had created a girls' high school there. Not a boys' high school or a boys' primary school or a girls' primary school, but a girls' high school. And the reason you got that relationship was that these environments had locally constrained labor markets. And so if you're living in an environment where a skilled person is locally constrained, in this case, women, this was a conservative setting, this is Pakistan. Sorry, I don't know if I've mentioned that. In that case, when you increase supply of local schooling, you will get basically a essentially cheaper labor force for that time, which then creates entrepreneurship. It promotes these schools to arise. Again, if you're kind of rolling your eyes saying this is a terrible world to be in, this is how in 1800s in Massachusetts, a lot of women were actually teachers. They should have been CEOs, but they were teachers. But that fact that you got such high-skilled teachers to show up was a very big boon on future generations of students who got these amazing women to teach them. And that's very much, at least in our environment, what we were seeing. So those are just three examples. One is information, the other is finance, the third is labor markets, where these large system-level frictions, once you alleviate, can actually lead to really, in this case, the amazing outcome you led to is a massive increase in affordable, very low-cost private education. And this is something, again, we documented when we were beginning. The notion was that private schooling was a very elite phenomena, and we'll talk about the Chilean experience. In our case, it wasn't. It was a very affordable phenomena, and the only reason it was an affordable phenomena was there was a very affordable supply of teaching talent in the community, which you could leverage to kind of create these schools. And I'm going to hand back over to
So Chile and my role in Chile is very different because I was working for the World Bank and I was responsible for their work in Chile. And they had asked us to advise in a major institutional reform. And just as way of background, Chile has had a nationwide school choice program since the 1970 during a dictatorship. And so all sort of it was fully a market system for education. The Pinochet regime had most of his ministers had gone to the University of Chicago, and they were called the Chicago Boys, and really believed in the Milton Friedman model that education should be totally privately provided, and the best schools would survive, and the worst ones would be closed. So that was sort of the unfettered nationwide school choice program that was in place from 1981 to 1990, the year in which democracy sort of returned to Chile. And between 1990 and 2008, there were what we call like targeted supply side interventions. Still a real belief that the markets would sort like education, but also data coming out because they were measuring student achievement regularly in order to inform choice. That there were some schools that were consistently underperforming. And so there was a program called P900 that kind of provided more inputs to those schools, those 900 schools. But also, the country was not a rich country, today it's a middle high income country, but back then it was still a very low income country. And so the voucher also was modified, and instead of being an equal payment to all schools, whether public or private, private schools were allowed to charge a fee from families if the families agreed. And those fees and the voucher would be adjusted, but the schools would not be penalized. So they were incentivized to charge fees as much as they could. And so in a sense, what happened over this period is a complete segmentation of the market by price. And there was a lot of research, both by academics outside of Chile, but also very highly trained academics in Chile that showed that schools were very segregated socioeconomically, meaning that poor children were attending schools, whether public or private, with other poor children, and so on. And in 2008, there was an effort to change this by introducing what is called the CEP, or preferential school subsidy, which was a change in the voucher scheme that was optional for schools to opt in. But if they opted in, they would get more money per student who was in the 40% poorest part of the student distribution of income. And they would also get what was called like a bonus for concentration. So if you were a school that had 15% of children who qualified, you got a small step up for all your enrollment. But if you were a school with 80% of poor children, like the recognition was that it was a harder task for you to get good results. But also this came accompanied by a lot of accountability measures. So schools who participated in CEP also had to be subject to sort of an evaluation by then the Ministry of Education, and then there was a new agency created for this purpose in part, and so on. So this is in 2008, and only 2 years later, they decide to sort of take this at scale because they're seeing some positive effects, but there's also a lot of protest. Actually, I have some data on each of these, sorry. So 2010, 2 new agencies are created, an education quality agency and a superintendency of education, both alongside what was then the Ministry of Education. And the idea is that they wanted to ensure that this market would have better information, more independent information through the agency, but also that the system would learn from how the public resources were being used in a way that prior there was no requisite or no requirement for schools to report. And now with the superintendency, they would have more information. So it mandates stronger school accountability based on student learning, not just attendance, like the original voucher, and it's for both public and private schools just the same. So 2014, there had been a lot of protest led by students who felt that even if they were attending schools financed by the state and they had choice, at the end of the day, when they applied to universities and they had to take this high stakes exam, there were huge disparities between students attending public schools and private schools. And so she wins on a platform saying, we're going to end for-profit schools, we're going to end school selection, we're going to establish a stronger public education system, and we're going to have tuition-free higher education, which hadn't happened until that time. But actually, to her surprise, even though she was elected with this mandate, the reforms actually took a lot longer to pass. There was resistance from almost everywhere to, for example, having a centralized lottery for allocating on a rank ordered preference student assignment to schools. Actually, Chris Nielsen has been working on that. Parents opposed that because they felt like a right to choose was being taken away from them. For-profit school owners didn't want to have their for-profit removed. The Catholic Church, which is very big in Chile, and runs a lot of schools, also was completely against having all these rights taken. The right and the left, I mean, it was crazy, like nobody really, and it took a really long time to pass. In the end, I think it passed because there was a lot of evidence. And so that would be my call for all of you. Like, it is wonderful if you can go and do a very clean RCT. But in some cases, it's very hard to do. And where countries have, I think, pushed the frontier in terms of improving is when they have really good assessment data. And Chile has been like, because of their own model of nationwide school choice, assessing regularly all students, at least in some grades, for a really long time. And today you can even have longitudinal data. So in 2015, they ended the for-profit education. They ended this idea that schools could charge this co-payment because that also was shown to generate some inequalities. And they established a centralized school admission system, similar to how you apply and get into med schools in the US with an algorithm and you rank your choices. And then there's a centralized admission system that will assign students to kind of some, and it's been shown thanks to Chris and others who have done research that most students get their first or second choices. So it hasn't led to huge disappointments. And then on top of that, in 2016, they did a huge reform to teachers where they increased non-teaching hours to sort of recognize that teachers need to prepare for class and work together, but also importantly, a merit-based career ladder. There's now a probationary period, and if you don't pass an exam, you really cannot become a tenured teacher. And then as a tenured teacher, you can continue to advance without leaving the classroom, unlike many other systems, by staying in teaching, but also getting recognition, both in terms of significantly in terms of pay. And more recently in 2017, and this is now I'm in a different bank, but still got the opportunity to advise them, they decided to take away the responsibility of delivering public education from 345 municipal governments. So imagine if in the US, districts delivered education like they do, but there was no state figure. And so in a way, there were municipalities or districts that were very well resourced and had capacity and had a lot of schools, and others that were very remote or poor or both, and had very little capacity, even with the voucher, because it was a per student subsidy. So this idea of a new public education service is the idea of not re-centralizing to the ministry, but creating these 70 local education services distributed across the country, but not tied to the political sort of geographic divisions, so that they're locally elected school boards like that run these systems. So I just wanted to show you that although this was not a controlled experiment, oops, sorry, and I'll finish with this, and I think we were able to do a quasi-experimental study of the impact of the SEP law with Dick Murnane from the Ed School, and I was at the IDB, but I collaborated with them. And what we found is if you look at the top curve is after the SEP, what happened to test scores compared to 2005 before the program. And this is the same group of students. So the 40th% poorest in the country before and after the reform. So it's in a sense a regression discontinuity, where the discontinuity is the time of the reform. And what we look at is sort of an overall increase for everyone. The curve is much higher, but that increase is much higher among the poorest. In the 20% income percentile of the family, you see an increase of 16.3 points in their national assessment, whereas among the richest is around 10%, or 10 points, sorry. And I will conclude to that. Just one last point. Just one last point is to say that you have seen over time, Chile has gone from being sort of an average performer in PISA, the International Assessment of Student Performance, for Latin America, and much below the OECD, to kind of improving sustainably over time. And so we're thinking that is a positive thing. I would say, like, thinking system-wide, some of the lessons that we have learned is that when money follows the student, what you pay for matters. So when you only pay for attendance, you get attendance. But when you pay for learning, you might get improvements in learning and more focus. Also, that to reach adequate student learning levels, the per student costs are not equal. So having this idea of a voucher that's equivalent for all, which Chile did for many years, has shown to kind of generate a lot of inequality. Also, that when you have accountability, but you don't have support systems, and I didn't talk too much about that, but that's something else that Chile kind of shows some that. And institutions matter, and also that the system keeps reforming. So I'll conclude with that.
One thing, I mean, Emiliana, you can see already from the work, I mean, Juan Saavedra is there who's doing some really fabulous work in Colombia. One thing we see in Latin America, which is great for this kind of systems approaches, is tremendous data available. Right. And that's beginning to change, by the way. A lot of other countries in the regions in the world are beginning to get kind of admin data, because when you take the systems view, in some sense, to measure these GE effects, you actually need a lot of data, right? You need to be able to trace both spillovers in terms of other actors in your ecosystem, but also geographical spillovers and sort of system-wide changes. But that's becoming more and more feasible. So in many ways, I think this approach, I think, is getting easier. I just want to end with sort of conceptually, does this approach really matter? Like, does it make a difference in how you view education? We would argue it actually does. And what I want to do is just end with a couple of slides just on saying, look, what would a traditional view make you think, kind of this more input specific view versus a systems view? So, you know, in a traditional view, and I alluded to this as well, we often used to think that parents and children are kind of disengaged, especially in poor countries, in the education process. So they need to be cajoled. And what we're beginning to, and this led to a specific policy. So these views of the world are powerful. And in some sense, the work you generate is doubling down on these views, and these views lead to significant money being spent on certain policies. So this view of disengaged parents led to CCTs, a massive movement in CCTs. Our work mostly shows that actually parents and children are in fact actively engaged when you actually look at the data. And if that's your view, CCTs are not a good use of money at all. You're not going to get that many people who are actually on the margin affected by these. And in this view of the world, instead of trying to do conditionalities on doing a certain behavior, you assume people are doing that behavior and you look at what are the costs in doing that behavior. So maybe you are trying to actively choose schools, but you don't have information or resources in making that choice. So we're going to give you that information and resources. You know, you often have this view that the public sector is a sole provider of education, and you begin to see in the systems view, there's so many other actors, all the way from private schools to nonprofit schools to home tutoring services. By the way, one of the largest rises in education now in the developing world is actually tutoring services, and not just paid, there's paid, but there's also unpaid. There's people in the neighborhood who kind of helping. And this is also going Baiju and others, if you want to look at that kind of a narrative on sort of online education. This is big. So if you have this belief, you spend a lot of public sector money and do large public centralized programs. If you believe there's multiple players in it, then you start thinking of how do I engage? How do I, as a state or a public entity, intervene in a way that crowds in other players as opposed to crowds out other players? And you can imagine doing research or policies on this kind of view as well. You know, there's a lot of Best Buys, and I know we're excited about Best Buys and kind of what are the best wins or Best Buys, the different names we use for these things. You know, the problem with Best Buys is it's very easy excuse for people to say, well, this is a Best Buy, so I'm just going to do it in my country because there's a Best Buy somewhere else. I don't like that approach because it shuts down thinking locally. Because if you're applying a Best Buy, you don't need to think, it's just a Best Buy. It must be working, it's a Best Buy, right? And so when you take away this idea that reform is not a list of products, it's not that there's a best product out there that you should adopt, but reform is about setting up learning processes, exactly what Emiliana alluded to, like systems need to learn as well. Then you go towards like best process, not best product. And that's a very different approach, right? This approach leads to building local institutions, getting local researcher collaboration. What I love about Chile is it wasn't just outsiders studying Chile. There was a very active research agenda within Chile. There was a very active debate in policy within Chile. So it wasn't just research in isolation. It wasn't we writing papers and people are not reading our papers and we're worried about that. It was actually people critiquing that work and pushing other work to happen. And that's another ecosystem that we'd love to see more of. And also a lot of this kind of view on traditional it was a lot of belief was on cost efficiency and scaling. Like, oh, this works. How do we make it cheaper? And how do we get it to scale? And there's still, by the way, this obsession we have with scaling. And you'll see it in a lot of times. We did a great pilot. Why doesn't it scale? But the problem with this kind of scaling approach is it assumes there's like one, again, perfect product, but you need to scale up. In this kind of more systems view, it's actually much more, Rem is, we're going to move over to my HBS colleagues in a second, but this idea of frugal innovation, it's a very different way of thinking. It's not about scaling. It's simply making innovation and adaptation be easier to do in your environment. And so this leads to a much more entrepreneurial way of thinking about education, right? It's not, we want to find processes and policies which promote interesting innovation to happen. And then the system should be able to pick winners. And that's, I think, very much Chile. The Chilean success is that it allowed for that kind of sort of more flexible and innovative markets. I'll stop over here. I think we have maybe 5 minutes for questions as well. I don't want to eat too much into the next session, but let's stop and sort of take comments, critiques. We are actively, just if it's not clear, we are pushing for this approach because we do think it adds value, but I'm happy to get pushback in the spirit of pushing.
Go ahead. You talked about the importance of thinking of the deeper frictions, and you mentioned finance. I'm just wondering, in terms of thinking about, say, for instance, credit misallocation, to what extent do we need to have a non-standard kind of lens, say, not just have a firm's lens in terms of links literally to what Emiliana said about maybe some resistance to for-profits? To what extent do we have to have a different lens, different production function, different objective function, difficulty of collateralization, etc., or can we approach it in a similar way?
Great question. So absolutely we need to. In fact, I've been doing some work on like social impact investing, which is another odd thing which we think about, but it's very much what are interesting instruments which allow for more creative financing, which isn't just the standard way of doing things, because in the standard way, only a certain type of firm will survive and produce. So you can think of blended finance, you can think of more equity-based lending, you can think of conditionalities on outcome-based lending. There's a whole bunch of stuff you can do over here, but it all comes back to like, who are the nascent actors who you think in your ecosystem are needing money? I mean, just in the finance literature, there's really cool stuff on like, even if you change like the terms of the loan, I mean, Rohini and colleagues, Rohini and Natalia Rugol and colleagues have this really cool paper where if you literally start a standard loan with a 3-month forgiveness period, you're going to get more innovation happening. So it's not even the same actors who get money may change the behavior given the nature of the instrument you give them. And I think that the general spirit of what we're trying to do is get more local innovation to happen, which is risky finance, but create an environment where you can get that kind of risky finance to work. That's exactly right.
I mean, I would just add, because I think a part of the education challenge that is ripe for something like this has to do with education technology and the amount of products that are being developed without a lot of evidence of what works to improve learning. And so could we develop ways of that are more smart in terms of how these get financed? I think would be really nice.